If you drive anywhere in the United States, February 2026 could quietly become one of the most expensive months of your life. Not because of gas prices, not because of car payments, not because of inflation or interest rates, but because a set of new driving laws is about to flip the rules of the road in a way most drivers still don't see coming. These changes weren't debated loudly on cable news. They weren't rolled out with public service announcements or warnings on nightly broadcasts. They moved fast behind closed doors, through committee votes and regulatory meetings that the average driver would never think to attend. And they were designed to do one thing extremely well: catch violations at scale. Technology will be doing the watching, monitoring every mile you drive. Systems will be doing the calculating, analyzing patterns you don't even realize you're creating. And the penalties won't be small. We're not talking about warnings. We're not talking about $50 tickets. We're talking about fines that start in the hundreds and escalate rapidly into the thousands. Starting in February 2026, 5 new rules will begin taking money directly out of drivers' pockets, often without a police officer ever pulling you over, without lights flashing in your rearview mirror, without any interaction at all until the notice arrives in your mailbox. Hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars, in some cases compounding penalties that don't stop until you comply, that accumulate daily, that can spiral out of control faster than most people can respond. What makes this moment dangerous isn't just the rules themselves. It's how suddenly they're being enforced, how quietly they were finalized, and how unprepared most drivers are right now. Because by the time many people realize what changed, the fines will already be active, the notices already sent, and the damage already done. Your checking account already lighter, your options already limited. For months before this became public, the warning signs were there for anyone who knew where to look. Transportation analysts noticed something unusual happening in Washington. Meetings were taking place behind closed doors. Federal agencies were coordinating with technology companies in ways they hadn't before. Enforcement budgets were being redirected toward departments that had been underfunded for years, suddenly receiving substantial appropriations. Even more telling, the usual push back from automotive and insurance lobbyists went silent. Industry groups that normally challenge every regulatory shift simply stopped objecting. And when transportation policy goes quiet at the federal level, when the usual voices of opposition suddenly have nothing to say, it almost always means the decision has already been made. The deals have been struck. The implementation is inevitable. My name is Sophia, and I've spent years tracking how regulatory shifts like this actually affect everyday people. Not in theory, not in policy white papers, but in real life when the bills arrive, when bank accounts get hit, when people suddenly can't afford to drive to work. What made this moment stand out wasn't just that new driving laws were coming. That happens periodically. What was different was how fast everything lined up at once. State DMVs began quietly adjusting their codes, updating systems, training staff on new procedures. Insurance companies updated internal risk models, recalibrating how they assess driver behavior. Law enforcement agencies started purchasing new monitoring technology before the public ever heard a word, equipment that wouldn't make sense unless major enforcement changes were imminent. This wasn't gradual reform. This wasn't the slow evolution of traffic policy over years. This was preparation, coordinated preparation. And preparation at that scale only happens when enforcement is about to accelerate dramatically. The question was never whether new driving rules would arrive. The real question was how aggressive they would be, how much money they would extract from unprepared drivers, and whether drivers would realize what was happening before February 2026 made compliance non-optional. By early summer of 2025, the timeline finally became clear. February 2026 wasn't chosen at random. It wasn't picked because it's a quiet month or because winter driving is different. It was the moment federal systems would be fully synchronized, when state enforcement agencies would be operationally ready, and when automated monitoring networks would go live nationwide simultaneously. This wasn't a soft rollout. This wasn't a pilot program in a few test cities. Federal transportation officials described it internally as an activation phase. That language matters because activation means enforcement begins immediately, Not after months of warnings, not after public education campaigns, just immediate, full-scale enforcement. By February 2026, every state will be aligned with the same baseline standards, the same verification systems, and the same penalty structures. No more state-by-state variations, no more jurisdictional confusion. And once that switch flips, there is no grace period built in for confusion or ignorance. Officials have already confirmed that within weeks of the start date, active monitoring will begin across all 50 states. Not the occasional traffic stop most drivers are used to, not the random checkpoint, but continuous technology-driven oversight, the kind that doesn't miss a lapse, doesn't forget a violation, and doesn't offer discretion or second chances. What makes this especially concerning is how few drivers are aware of what's coming. Recent surveys conducted by transportation research groups show that fewer than a quarter of licensed drivers can even identify one of these new rules correctly. Many drivers have heard vague rumors. Some have seen headlines, but very few understand the specifics or the financial stakes. That gap between enforcement readiness and public awareness is exactly where financial damage happens, because the systems don't wait for people to catch up. They don't pause enforcement until everyone has been properly informed. They simply start issuing penalties, automatically and continuously. What also makes February 2026 different from past regulatory changes is how enforcement itself has evolved beyond recognition. For decades, traffic laws relied heavily on human intervention. An officer had to observe a violation, make a judgment call, and initiate a stop. That process naturally limited how many violations could be enforced. There are only so many officers, so many hours in the day, so many traffic stops that can physically happen. These new rules removed that limitation almost entirely. Enforcement is no longer bound by manpower or visibility or an officer's line of sight. It's built into infrastructure. Cameras, sensors, databases, and automated verification systems will now handle tasks that once required human discretion, human observation, human decision-making. That shift changes everything about how driving is regulated. A brief insurance lapse that might have gone unnoticed for days or weeks now triggers an automatic fine the moment the system detects it. Slowing down only when you see a camera no longer works when your average speed is being calculated over miles of highway. A glance at a phone that once depended on an officer's direct observation can now be detected by fixed systems that never blink, never get tired, never look away. This is why officials have described the changes as transformative. They're not just updating penalties or adjusting fines. They're redefining how compliance is measured. And when compliance is measured continuously, when every mile is monitored and every moment is analyzed, violations become inevitable for anyone who isn't prepared. The financial implications of that reality are enormous. Experts estimate that unprepared drivers could face anywhere from $500 to well over $10,000 in penalties in the first year alone, depending on how many systems they trigger, how many violations accumulate, how quickly they respond. That's not speculation. Those figures are already written into federal and state traffic codes. The penalty schedules exist, the enforcement mechanisms are ready. This is the point where driving in the United States shifts from casual compliance to constant accountability, and the drivers who feel that shift first will be the ones who assumed nothing had really changed, who thought traffic enforcement would remain basically the same as it's always been. The first rule takes aim at something most drivers never think about, even though it's already inside their vehicle: silently recording data every time they drive. Beginning in February 2026, mandatory event data recorder compliance becomes a fully enforceable requirement. If your vehicle was manufactured after 2018, it is expected to have an event data recorder, often called an EDR, in verified working condition. This device is not optional, and it's no longer treated as background technology that exists in the shadows of your dashboard. It becomes an inspection item, something that must be verified, something that can fail. If the system is malfunctioning, disconnected, or shows signs of tampering, the penalty is immediate. The base fine starts at $750, and that's before any secondary consequences are considered. That's just for the violation itself. What makes this rule especially powerful is how it connects enforcement agencies and insurance companies in ways they've never been connected before. Event data recorders capture precise information about how a vehicle was operating just before an incident, including speed, braking pressure, throttle input, steering angle. Starting in February 2026, insurers are granted expanded access to this data during claims and investigations. That means driving behavior is no longer a matter of interpretation or he said, she said disputes. It's documented, it's time-stamped, it's irrefutable. For years, drivers assumed these systems existed mainly for crash analysis, for NTSB investigations after major accidents. Now they function as accountability infrastructure. They prove exactly how a vehicle was driven, and they remove ambiguity from fault determinations. For drivers who haven't checked whether their vehicle's system is functioning properly, this rule creates an invisible risk. You won't know there's a problem until an inspection reveals it, until a claim triggers a review, or until a roadside check catches it. And by then, the fine is already attached to your record. This is the moment many drivers realize that modern vehicles aren't just transportation anymore. They're evidence, they're witnesses, they're data collection platforms that remember everything. The second rule is the one transportation officials expect to generate the highest volume of penalties in the shortest amount of time. Real-time insurance verification becomes fully active nationwide in February 2026, and it fundamentally changes how coverage is enforced. The familiar ritual of handing over an insurance card during a traffic stop is effectively obsolete. That paper card or digital image on your phone no longer proves anything to the system. A national verification database now connects law enforcement systems, toll infrastructure, and automated license plate readers in real time. Every scan checks your coverage instantly. Not yesterday's coverage, not last month's policy. Coverage at that exact moment. If your policy has lapsed, even for a single day, even for a few hours due to a payment processing delay, the system flags it automatically. There is no warning period built into this process. There's no notification saying, we noticed your insurance lapsed. You have 10 days to resolve this. The first offense triggers a $1,000 fine immediately. A second offense escalates to $2,500 and includes mandatory license suspension, not points on your license. Suspension, your legal right to drive, is revoked until you prove continuous coverage. What makes this rule especially dangerous is how common short lapses actually are. Missed payments due to bank errors, billing mistakes, coverage gaps when switching providers because your new policy starts on the 15th, but your old policy ended on the 14th. These situations are more frequent than most drivers realize, and in the past, those gaps might have gone unnoticed unless an officer happened to ask for proof at exactly the wrong moment. Now, the system is always checking every license plate reader you pass, every toll booth you drive through, every parking enforcement vehicle that scans your plate while driving by. All of them are verifying insurance status in real time. It doesn't care why the lapse happened. It doesn't consider intent or circumstances. It only verifies whether coverage exists at that exact moment. And once a violation is recorded, reversing it becomes extremely difficult, even if you reinstate coverage immediately. This is where many drivers will get caught off guard. Not because they chose to drive uninsured, not because they're trying to break the law, but because they assumed a brief gap wouldn't matter, that they'd fix it before anyone noticed, that the old system would give them time. Starting in February 2026, it matters immediately, and time is no longer a buffer. If staying ahead of changes like this helps you avoid costly mistakes, make sure you're subscribed because the rules are shifting fast and missing one detail can be expensive. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's continue. The third rule is the one that pushed safety advocates to demand faster enforcement, and it's also the one most drivers underestimate until it happens to them. Cell phone detection technology becomes fully enforceable in February 2026, and it doesn't work the way people assume. These aren't just red light cameras with better lenses. These are advanced systems installed at major intersections and along busy corridors that analyze hand position, device placement, and screen illumination inside moving vehicles. They use thermal imaging, motion detection, and artificial intelligence to assess what's happening inside your car as you drive past. They can tell the difference between a phone resting in a cup holder and a phone being actively used. They can detect the posture associated with texting, the angle of your head when you're scrolling, the position of your hand when you're holding a device near eye level. And they operate continuously, scanning every vehicle that passes through their detection zone. There is no officer discretion involved, no judgment call about whether you were really using the phone or just glancing at it. The system makes the determination based on parameters it's been programmed to recognize. The first violation carries a $500 fine. The second jumps to $1,000 and includes a mandatory distracted driving course that costs additional money and takes time you may not have. The third triggers a 90-day license suspension, not points, not a warning. Suspension. By the end of the rollout, more than 300 metropolitan areas will have these systems active, with expansion planned beyond that into suburban and even rural corridors. This isn't just big cities. This is nationwide infrastructure. What makes this rule especially punishing is how normalized phone use has become behind the wheel. Many drivers don't consider quick glances to be violations. Many assume enforcement only happens when an officer witnesses it directly and decides to pull you over. That assumption no longer holds. These systems don't issue warnings. They don't wave you down and explain what you did wrong. They issue notices that arrive in the mail days later with photographic evidence, time-stamped and geolocated. And once a violation is recorded, contesting it becomes difficult because the evidence is visual, automated, and systematically logged. For drivers who rely on muscle memory more than conscious intention, this rule alone could generate multiple penalties in a short period of time. It's not about whether you think you're being careful. It's about whether the system detected behavior it's programmed to flag. The fourth rule changes something drivers have relied on for decades without even realizing it. Speed enforcement is no longer about a single moment, a snapshot of your speedometer at one location. Beginning in February 2026, average speed monitoring zones expand across federal highways and major corridors. Instead of measuring how fast you were going at one point, cameras now record your entry time and exit time between two locations that might be 5 miles apart, 10 miles apart, or even longer stretches. Your average speed across that entire distance is calculated automatically. If it exceeds the posted limit, a violation is generated. Slowing down when you see a camera no longer protects you because the entire distance is monitored. The system knows when you entered the zone, it knows when you exited, and it knows exactly how long that trip should have taken if you were obeying the speed limit. This rule catches drivers who maintain speeds just slightly above the limit for extended periods, not just those who spike their speed briefly. The person going 72 and a 65 for 20 miles straight is now at risk, even though they'd never get pulled over under traditional enforcement. Violations start at $300 for exceeding the limit by less than 10 miles per hour on average. That escalates to $800 when the average exceeds the limit by more than 15 miles per hour. And these zones are already being installed on major interstate corridors across the country. What makes this especially effective from an enforcement standpoint is that it removes the gamesmanship drivers have learned over years of traditional speed traps. There's no guessing where the camera is hidden. There's no timing a slowdown. There's no radar detector that helps you avoid detection. The system only cares about the math, about the time calculation that can't be manipulated, and because the calculation happens after the fact, processed by computers hours or days later, drivers often don't realize they violated the rule until the notice arrives in the mail, sometimes weeks after the drive happened. For commuters who travel long distances daily, who spend hours on highways every week, this rule quietly increases exposure to repeated fines. A habit that once felt harmless, that never got you pulled over, can suddenly become expensive, very expensive. This is the point where many drivers realize that enforcement is no longer reactive. It's analytical, it's mathematical, and when enforcement becomes analytical, consistency matters more than momentary behavior. You can't talk your way out of a calculation. The fifth rule completes the enforcement picture, and it's the one with the most severe long-term financial consequences. Beginning in February 2026, emissions compliance is no longer limited to scheduled inspections at registered facilities or repair shop visits every couple of years. New roadside emission sensors will begin operating passively along major roadways, meaning they can detect non-compliant vehicles as they drive past without ever stopping traffic. Without requiring any action from the driver, these systems analyze exhaust output in real time and compare it against federal emissions standards. If a vehicle fails, if its emissions exceed acceptable thresholds, a violation notice is automatically generated and mailed to the registered owner within 72 hours. The initial fine starts at $400, but that's only the beginning of what becomes a compounding problem. Once flagged, the vehicle enters what's called a compliance window. Repairs must be completed and verified within 30 days. Miss that deadline and daily penalties of $50 begin accumulating. These penalties don't pause while you wait for parts. They don't reset if you're between paychecks. They don't stop for hardship. After 90 days of non-compliance, registration suspension becomes automatic. That means the vehicle is no longer legally drivable, even if insurance is active, even if everything else is in order. Your registration is void until compliance is verified. What makes this rule especially costly is that many drivers won't know they're out of compliance until the notice arrives. Older vehicles with aging catalytic converters, modified exhaust systems, deferred maintenance that affects emissions controls, all of these increase risk substantially. Repairs to bring a vehicle back into compliance can easily exceed $2,000, especially when emission control systems are involved. Catalytic converters alone can cost over $1,000 depending on the vehicle. Add labor, diagnostics, and verification testing, and the costs compound quickly. This turns what used to be an occasional inconvenience into an ongoing financial threat. The longer a driver delays action, the more expensive the situation becomes. This rule isn't designed to encourage compliance gently. It's designed to force it quickly to make non-compliance financially unbearable. And this is where the impact becomes uneven, where the reality of these rules creates very different outcomes for different people. Transportation analysts and consumer advocates have been clear about who faces the greatest risk under these new rules. Lower-income drivers, households with older vehicles, and people who rely on driving for daily work will feel the pressure first and hardest. A newer car with factory-fresh systems and stable insurance coverage is far less likely to trigger multiple violations. Modern vehicles with updated technology, current emissions equipment, and reliable electronic systems are essentially designed for this enforcement environment. An older vehicle with deferred maintenance, aging sensors, or emissions issues is far more exposed. These are the vehicles that will get flagged by roadside emission sensors. These are the vehicles more likely to have malfunctioning event data recorders. These are the vehicles that cost more to bring into compliance. The same is true for insurance. Drivers living paycheck to paycheck are more likely to experience short coverage gaps, even if unintentional, even if they're desperately trying to stay current. A missed payment that bounces, a billing error that takes days to resolve, a brief lapse when switching jobs and insurance providers. Under the old system, those gaps might never have been noticed. Under the new system, they're instantly penalized at $1,000 per occurrence. What makes this especially concerning is how penalties compound. One violation often leads to another in a cascade effect. An emissions issue leads to registration problems. A registration problem leads to higher insurance costs because you now have violations on your record. Higher insurance costs increase the risk of coverage lapses because the premiums are harder to afford. Coverage lapses lead to license suspension. This cycle doesn't just punish non-compliance. It traps drivers financially. It creates a spiral that becomes harder and harder to escape. And that's why critics argue these rules represent more than safety reform. They represent a shift in how driving privilege is enforced, using financial pressure as the primary tool, making it increasingly expensive to remain mobile if you're not financially stable. For drivers who are already stretched thin, who are already living on tight budgets, preparation isn't optional. It's the difference between staying mobile and being priced off the road entirely.